Hello and welcome back to HiCode tutorial. This video is about APIs. If you haven't found any need for APIs, you can skip this session and jump to the next video. Today we'll start with an introduction on API and the HiCode API widgets. Next we'll look at the three elements of API, and I'll also give an example to show you how to use APIs in HiCode. First, the introduction. So API is short for Application Programming Interface, and it is a way for two or more computer programs to communicate with each other, using a set of definitions and protocols. It is a type of software interface, offering a service to other pieces of software. One purpose of APIs is to hide the internal details of how a system works, exposing only those parts a programmer will find useful and keeping them consistent even if the internal details later change, so that users can use the system without knowing how it works. API lowers the bar of developing, and usually, for example, people request APIs for weather forecast, machine translation, image recognition, and so on. And in HiCode, we offer you front-end and back-end API widgets. I'd like to invite you to read the manuals to see when to use them. And moving on to the next part, three elements. Three elements of APIs include request URL, request parameters, and response. Let's go to the editor and see these elements in practice. For today's example, we will be making a weather report application. You can find API on the stage or on the server. You can find API widgets on the stage or on the server. And I would suggest we use API for the server. And after we've set the properties for this API, we will call it with a service. And if you need some instructions on how to use service, there is a video on services. In the API widgets property panel, you can find first the URL. And this is one of the three elements. And next, these lines are the input parameters, or the request parameters. You'll have to set the method, usually get, and timeout, header, request type, and body. We usually put the input parameters inside body. And after these are all set, click Show Return JSON, and the response will be displayed here. So the request URL, request parameters, and response. Before we get started, let's look for an API that we can use for today. So how do we find an API? Actually, just Google the kind of API that you are looking for. And now you are provided with a lot of options. I'm going to use this one for today's demonstration. Going to their page, you can see various services that they offer. And for today, you can go to their documentation to learn more about these APIs. I think this current weather data is what we are looking for. Let's go on to see what they have in the documentation. First, an address, and then some parameters. Actually, this is exactly what we need in the API widgets property panel. This is the URL, and for now we don't need to worry about the timeout. And these parameters go into the body. For the parameters, there are two required parameters and others are optional. The first required option is the city's information. To look for a city's weather, you have to input its latitude and longitude. And second, you'll need an app ID, and this is the unique API key. Actually, I think they have an API that accepts city names instead of the coordinates. This built-in geocoding, we will use this one instead. So for this one, the parameters, you'll still need the app ID, and this one is a Q, it's the city name. We can add them here. The parameter names should be consistent with the names provided here. So Q and app ID. It didn't specify any type, so we can have any for the type, but some may require, for example, for the city name, it should be a string. Next, let's go to look for our API key. Go back to the provider's website, and you can always find it on your account page under the API key tab. So after registration, which I have already done, go to account page and API keys. You can activate and deactivate a key, or you can create new ones. I'm going to generate a new key, and you can find it at the bottom. We're going to copy this and go back to the property panel. The key we've just obtained should go to the app ID's value. And next we're going to fill in the URL. So for this API, it provides 3 URLs. You can see from the parameters here, the first one accepts city name, the second one accepts another additional country code, and this one supports state code. We'll just stick to the simplest one. Copy it and go back to the URL session. And we'll have to delete everything behind this question mark and itself. Just keep the front part. And for the request method, it doesn't specify one in this documentation, so you can try it out. For this one, we should use GET. And some API providers will tell you which one to use in their documentation. And for timeout, now we don't need to worry about that. And go to this name, Q. It is the city's name that we are searching for, so by default, we'll try London. And now, click this Show Return JSON. It shows the response in the debug session, and the response is in JSON format. We can scroll down and use this Save JSON structure. This will give us all the field names in this response. And to know the meaning of all these fields, we can refer to the documentation. Go to this Weather Fields in API response. And this is an example of API response. And here you can find all the definitions for these fields. For example, we have weather condition ID and other parameters. Inside this main field, we have temperature and the human perception of temperature, also pressure, humidity, so on and so forth. Now that we are able to acquire data from the API, we can complete the user interface and bind this data from the response to the user interface. And since this is a JSON format value, we can copy it and store it in a JSON variable widget. Go to the stage. First, we can add a page, and inside this page, a JSON variable. paste the response, we will just keep the format and confirm. This variable will help us to display this response. Let's go on to complete the user interface. For this JSON, I will name it weather response. And first, I will need an input box to take the search. And first, I will need an input box for us to search the target city. And next, a button, and below them, I will display the response. Basically, all the elements are in a vertical layout, so I will go to set this page horizontal alignment to the center. Now when I add an input box and a button, they will appear in the center. First, give them both some top margin. And this button should read search weather by city name. And change the placeholder to give the user some hint. For example, enter city name. Next, we'll have a line that reads the current weather data of a certain city. Make it smaller. And the same margin top of 20 pixels. And next we'll have some rows of a bold parameter, a column, and the data. So we'll first add a row to make one of them, and we can copy paste them later. Inside this row we will have a text box, the text should read weather, make it bold and to a smaller size. We can copy paste it inside the row, and this one should not be bold. We can set the row's width to, for example, 200 pixels and make it wrap. Also give it a margin top of 20 pixels. Clear its background. And now we can use it repeatedly. For the second row, we can have temperature, and for the third, maybe humidity. We can go to the documentation to see what we want to display. For example, the cloud and wind speed. Going on like this, we now have wind speed, cloud, and visibility. We now have the user interface for successfully getting data. But there are also other scenarios where, for example, the target city is not supported. In this case, we'll have to use an if widget. For this one, it is success. And we will put all this row inside this if widget. And for the other VF widget, we'll let it show the reason if the search is failed. Copy this one inside it. And name this to failed. So now we have two displays according to the results. The next thing to do is to create a service and actions to allow us to get the results by actually clicking this button. Go to the server to add a service. And when the service is called, it should call the API1. In these lines, you can see if we leave them blank, they will use the default values set in the API. So we can just leave them blank. And for the parameters, we would like to use dynamic inputs so that we can add parameters. Click here to add another one. The first one is Q, and the other one is app-ID. Delete this default value and click and select its input. And for the output parameters, we will have three of them. First one to record if the service is successful. And second one to store the reason if the service fails. And the third one, the data in the response. And for the callback, if it is success, select current service, and this one should be true. When I entered true, it turned into blue, which shows this is a Boolean value. The data should be from the result value. Select this action again and add another callback. And this one is the failed branch. Same, select current service, and this time it should be false. And the reason we will use and for the data the same, results value. Rename this service to call weather and go back to the stage and add an actions group. We will use this actions group to call this service. For this actions group, we'll also need two input parameters, Q and app-ID. These two are the input parameters of the service, and we will communicate the input parameters of actions to the input parameters of service. When the actions is completed, we will store the values, the results, in this JSON variable. Set its value and to be result data. This data come from the call weather services output parameter, and it stores the API's response. And for the app ID or the API key, what we usually do is to store it in a string. Copy-paste my key here. In this way, whenever I want to change a new key, I only need to change the string's value, and it will change elsewhere. Go to this button and give it an event. When it is clicked, call the action group. The queue should come from the input box's value, and app ID is this key. We can go to the actions and add another action to print this value in the console log to see the results, since we haven't bind any data to this display. And let's go to the preview. Inspect. Let's say London again. And we have successfully obtained the response. Try another city, for example, Chengdu. And the new value is here. Now that we have all the data, the next step is to bind what we want to the user interface. And when a problem occurred, we will show the error page. Let's try to give it a random input, which is not a city name. And it returns code 404 and city not found. In the previous instances, the codes were 200. So that we can see this code is the error code and it indicates the status of the request. When the request is successful, it returns 200. And when a problem occurs, it returns a corresponding error code. For example, if I give it an empty input, and now it returns 400 and message nothing to jailcode. So that we can use this code in these two if widgets to switch between the two displays, whether it is successful or whether it failed. Remember, we have stored the results in this JSON variable. Let's go back to take a screenshot of the response. So that we can see how to locate a certain element. For this VIF widget, let's set the condition to if the code equals to 200 and it is successful. Select this JSON variable, and because we selected this save JSON structure, we can access all these entries in the drop-down list. Find the code that we need, it is here, and it equals to 200. Now when I obtain the data, it jumps to the page that displays the weather details. And vice versa, when it is failed, we can set the JSON variable code to not equal to 200. And this means it failed. And when the request is failed, I want to display in this line the reason why it is failed. When it is failed, the error code comes with a message. So how do we link this message to the text? Select this text, activate data binding, and first select this variable. But in this drop-down list, you'll find there is no such message. So what do I do now? We'll have to locate this message manually. First select the value. It didn't show the value here, so we need to call the drop-down list again. To find the drop-down list, press dot on your keyboard and select value again. And to use this message, enter another dot and type in message. And let's try whether it works. Enter a random city name. And here we have it, city not found. And this line should go with the successful branch. Let's go back to the editor and find this line. Drag it into this successful if widget. Move it to the top. There. And now we'll just have to complete all these bindings. This will be the main weather condition. Data binding, select weather response. And here we can go to this screenshot and see. I think I'll need to unfold these entries. Let's have a test value. And unfold them. Okay, so this first line, we can find it in weather, the first element, and main. So select weather, and you can't select this 0, which means first element in this drop-down list. So again, we'll have to first choose this value. You can see this weather is an array, and to access the array's first element, we will have to use a bracket and 0, followed by a dot and main. Click the blank area to apply. The next one, temperature. Select the variable again, and for temperature we will find it inside main and temp. We can go to the documentation to see the units. Here's our temperature. So the default unit is in Kelvin. It's a bit weird, but we can just go with it. Select main and temp. This will display here 307.09. If we wanted to be followed by a unit, we can add it here by a plus sign. This is how we link strings. And quote, and the unit K, kelvins. Going on with the humidity. Humidity is also inside this main, so main and humidity. The unit is in percentage mark. So add, don't forget the quote and percentage mark. Next one, wind speed. So wind speed is inside wind and speed. So go to wind and select speed. And the unit is miles per hour. Oh no, the default one is meter per second. So plus quote and m per second. For the cloud status, we'll find it inside clouds. And this is the cloudiness. It is followed by a percentage mark. So plus, quote, percentage mark. And last one, visibility. Visibility can be found here, visibility. So go to the response and find visibility. And the unit for this one is meters. And since we've just seen how to attach two strings, we can also attach the city name to this line. Activate its data binding and get the city name from the response. It is in main and name, or it is directly name, yeah. Add a string to it, say weather of city name. Let's go and check the result. Now before search, this is empty. Let's look up Chengdu again. It is now showing us all the data. It seems like we need a space here. Go back to this current weather and add a space. Add a space inside the quote. So the current weather of Vancouver, clouds, and we have all this data in place. Let's also try out the error messages. So for empty input, nothing to geocode. Okay, and so for a not city name, city not found. And before we conclude this video, one last thing to mention. When you are using an API in HiCode and you find it is not working, you can go to find some API testing applications to test your API. For example, the Postman API testing. You can first solve the problems in the API testing applications, if any, and then go to debug in HiCode Editor. That is all about this video on API, and thank you very much for watching.